Elohim. As simple as that, in our typical understanding, without going into deeper roots of it.
Yeah. And this verse, that's one of many verses that's used by the church to say that we're no longer under the Torah, that only by faith. So let's consider some things and then talk about the lesson. And last Friday, I said we're going to take a look at the sons of Jacob in order, and the blessings and even the curses that Jacob gave over the sons. So let's consider, first of all, what Jacob had to say about Reuben. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what we talked about in the two parashas. And then we're going to compare that to this. But what Jacob said to Reuben is in Bereshit 49, and it's verses 3 and 4. Everybody a second to get there.
Bereshit 3 and 4?
Bereshit 49.
49, 3 and 4.
49, 3 and 4. Thank you.
49 verses 3 and 4. And Jacob says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first fruits of my strength, the excellency of dignity, the excellency of power. Then he goes on to say, unstable as water, you do not excel, because you went up to your father's bed and you defiled it. He went up to my couch. Reuben was the firstborn. Reuben is the one that should have inherited the birthright. He should have been the one to receive the blessing. But Reuben did something. And what he did is he had an affair with one of Jacob's concubines. Okay? We have a birthright. But if we have an affair with the spiritual aspect of the supplanter, what does the supplanter mean? To supplant means to remove something by force or by treachery and to put a substitute in its place. So if we have a spiritual relationship with something that's not established by the word of Elohim, then we say that the word is living water and that it flows. But what happens here? Unstable as water. Because when you pour the water out of the glass that has form, or you pour the water out of the bottle or the bucket, as long as it's there, it has form. Even while it's pouring out of the pitcher into the glass, it still remains in form. It's flowing in a river, it has form. But when we pour water out on the floor, it goes everywhere. And it won't hold anything. So when we lose sight of the word of Elohim and go on into things that don't belong in the word of Elohim, then we start to lose our relationship with our Elohim and replace it with religion. Okay? Now, we look at tonight's parasha, and we talked about the plagues, and we talked about what we had said last year in our study that these things meant. That when we start to lose our relationship, we start to lose basically our faith. And we're going to talk about faith in detail here in a minute, but we begin to doubt. We begin to get distracted. We begin to make mountains out of molehills. And as a result, we begin to lose the components that build our relationship with Elohim until ultimately we're in the dark. And what happens in the end? The firstborn dies, that we lose our inheritance. We come to the gate, and he doesn't open the gate because we no longer have a relationship. He no longer knows us, and he says, depart from me, you workers of iniquity. Iniquity means lawlessness, to go contrary to Torah, because I don't know you. Now, we see in last week's parasha that Jacob, well, at the end of Bereshit, Jacob went to Egypt, contrary to what Elohim had told him to do. Jacob was told to stay in Canaan. But Jacob went on to Egypt. And we read that Elohim said it was okay. Because Elohim cannot affect what our free will is.
Right.
Elohim says, okay,
Permissive and perfect.
do what you want to do,
Yeah.
and we'll simply go with plan A, or plan B. But we read in Shemot, if I can find my way back there, that, there it is. We read in Shemot, in chapter 1, verse 5, that says, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls. And Joseph was in Egypt already. Now, what are we looking at here? That what came out of his loins was 70 souls. That now Joseph was in Egypt already because he chose to go to Egypt instead of staying in Canaan. What Elohim was to provide would be provided under a substitute. And it would be up to the people to perceive the difference. Because no longer would they be in basically a perfect setting to grow with Elohim. Now they were going to be in a setting where idolatry ran rampant, where luxury was crazy, where the goodness and the fat of the land was the best that there was in the world. And they moved to Egypt, and there was a new Pharaoh that didn't know Jacob and didn't know Joseph, and their life became difficult. What happened is they started to get comfortable, they started to get complacent, they started to say, well, this is okay, and this is okay. Now, they didn't have Torah yet, but they still had the rules that had been established with
The pre-existing oral Torah,
that had
basically.
been basically established with Noah, who passed them on to Shem. Shem passed them on to Abraham. Shem also passed them on to Isaac. Shem and Eber passed them on to Jacob. Abraham passed them on to Isaac. Isaac passed them on to Jacob. Jacob passed them on to his sons. So they understood what the will of Elohim was, and they knew how to walk correctly with Elohim. But what's happening now is they're being distracted by all the things that are around them. So they come to a point where they've lost their identity. Okay? They've come to a point where they've lost their identity. And one of the things that we read in tonight's parasha is Moses asks Elohim, who shall I say sent you? He says, I am that I am. I will be who I shall prove to be. Tell them my name is Yahuwah. That I am all that there is, all that there was, and all that there ever will be. Today, yesterday, and tomorrow. Why did he say this? Why did Moses say, when they asked me, Who shall I say sent you? Moses not know? Elohim says to Moses, was my name not known to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob? Now I'm making my name known to you. In other words, Moses didn't even know, because Moses had grown up in Egypt. And now Elohim says, this is my name. People have forgotten who I am. They've forgotten everything about me. You're going to have to go tell them who I am and tell them that I'm their hope and I'm their deliverance, and I'm here to take them out of bondage. Okay? With that in mind, let's take a look at our lesson for tonight. So we often hear, it's called, what is the faith? So we often hear that we're not under the Old Testament, but under the New Testament. In the epistle of Galatians, Paul states the following at chapter 2, verse 16. And he says, for we know that the sons of men are not made righteous by the works of the Torah, but by faith in Yeshua HaMashiach. Even we who have believed in him know that it is from the faith in Mashiach that we are made righteous, and not from the works of Torah. For from the works of Torah no one can be made righteous. So, this is one of the many verses found in Brit Hadashah, the epistles, especially the Pauline epistles, that are used to say, well, we're no longer under the law. We're no longer under all that Old Testament stuff. In fact, Galatians is, I would say, a Christian favorite, and it's an epistle that's shunned by Messianic believers because they don't quite know how to interpret it. They don't know how to look at it. So let's break this down a little bit. And we have to understand some things. It's simply assumed that Paul is talking about no longer having to keep the Torah. In other words, we are no longer under the Old Testament. But that only faith in Yeshua HaMashiach is all one need have, grace under the New Testament. And this assumption is made out of pure ignorance. It's made out of ignorance as to who Paul is addressing and exactly what is he saying to them. And we lose this information in translation. When we say Gentiles, we assume by what King James says that we're talking about Greeks. The Aramaic says that he was talking about the Armenians. This is a Semitic people descended from Hebrews that assimilated into the culture and beliefs of their captors during the diaspora. So Paul is essentially speaking to the children of Israel who, like the children of Israel in Egypt, had lost perspective as to who they were. So it is to these people that Paul is bringing the truth of the good news. Now, this is a word that we have to look at because it's not the same as the word used typically throughout the balance of the epistle. In this case, the word for gospels or good news in, we go up to chapter 2, verse 5, is sevartha. It means hope. The word evangelion, which is Aramaic that was taken from the Greek evangelion, means gospel or good news, is not used here. So who is Paul talking to first of all? He's talking to a Semitic people who have been displaced and lost their identity. And he's saying, hey, it's okay. Let me tell you about the hope that you have. Okay? Now, we go on. What is Paul bringing to these people? He's bringing them hope of being able to reconcile to Yehovah, their Elohim, through Yeshua HaMashiach, who has restored the covenant to them if they will believe and receive. Okay? The covenant had been broken. They had been taken into captivity, and they never left the places that they were in captivity at. They assimilated into what their captors basically were doing. So we go on, and it's that they believe and receive. Is he telling them that this is possible without keeping Torah? No. We have to understand what's happening before we can understand the phrase, the sons of men are not made righteous by the works of Torah. We have to understand first the balance of the phrase, but by faith in Yeshua HaMashiach. We have to understand what this means, as well as what the next sentence, even we who believed in him know that it is from the faith in Mashiach that we are made righteous, and not from works of Torah. So, what is he saying? What is the faith? So first and foremost, it is to recognize what Seh Elohim did in sending Yeshua HaMashiach to die in order to restore the covenant, minus the curse of the law of sin and death. Basically, minus the Levitical law, minus the sacrificial system, minus the thing that says, if you transgress any of these things, you're to be put to death. And you can only have redemption once a year. Same. Next, we have to understand that Mashiach, the perfect anointing of Yahuwah, can reside in the one who believes and receives that Yeshua paid the price of the covenant restoration in full. His blood took the place of the blood of animals. This made it possible to be forgiven for transgressions immediately upon making teshuvah, bringing us immediate restoration, immediate redemption, immediate deliverance from the penalty of death. Saying that if you're willing to follow, if you're willing to believe and receive, this is your hope. You can have these things. You can be restored to a relationship with Elohim. You can be restored in a way that you can have immediate redemption if you should transgress. That you don't have to wait once a year for the Levites to do it for you. So, if we understand that, then we say it isn't merely believing, but we must receive as well. And the second one of these items that we need to recognize is that Yeshua tells us that we are to listen to Elohim, acknowledge Elohim, and love Yahuwah Elohim with all our heart, soul, and strength. And that we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. Yeshua says this. He's asked, what is the greatest commandment? And then he recites the Shema, which we understand means to pay attention to what Elohim is telling you. To apply what Elohim is telling you to your life, and then to love Elohim with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Then he says the second one is just like it, that you love your neighbor as yourself. This is why when we open Galatians and we start reading what Paul is saying, he's been teaching this to these people. And then he says, in verse 6 of chapter 1, he says, I am stunned into silence as if dead, that you have so quickly forgotten Mashiach, who has called you to his grace, and have gone to another gospel that is non-existent, but there are men who agitated you and desire to pervert the good news of Mashiach. Again, this is where we say the hope of Mashiach. For if us or even a messenger from heaven preach outside what was preached to you, let them be cursed. What's been preached to them? The faith, what we just talked about. That Yeshua died for them to have this opportunity, that they can make teshuvah without consequences, and that they can have a relationship with Elohim. says, as I said before, so I say again, whichever man preaches to you outside of what you have received, let him be accursed.